Wet red dirt, the smell of chemical preservative lingering on white chrysanthemums as they baked under the October sun. The sharp crunch of a silver Buick throwing gravel as it backed out of the cemetery lot. None of it fit together. None of the pieces made a complete picture in my head. The casket had not even touched the bottom of the grave yet. I stood in the back row, staring at the polished wood, my hands empty at my sides. Beverly stood in the very front. Her black suit was perfectly tailored, the fabric stiff and expensive. Her shoulders trembled just enough to invite the comforting hands of relatives I had never met. And then, she simply turned and walked away. My mother-in-law did not look down into the earth. She did not glance in my direction. She walked straight to her car and drove away, while the men with the shovels were still leaning on their tools, waiting for the family to finish their goodbyes. I kept my eyes on the dark hole in the ground. At 32 years old, standing there as a widow of exactly 3 days, I thought the strange numbness in my chest was just what grief felt like. I did not know the ground had already shifted beneath my feet. 2:47 in the afternoon. That was the time on my dashboard clock when I pulled into the driveway of the house on Elm Street. I had lived in this house for 4 years. I knew that the third stair from the bottom always groaned under any weight. I knew the left kitchen faucet needed exactly 2 hard twists to stop dripping. I knew the neighbor's dog would bark twice whenever a strange car parked too close to the mailbox. I walked up the front steps and slid my key into the brass lock. The metal scraped loudly. I pulled the key out, checked the familiar grooves, and pushed it back in. It went all the way into the cylinder, but it refused to turn. I tried again, pressing harder. The small silver key to Jordan's medicine cabinet jingled against the brass one. It was the cabinet I had unlocked every single morning for 11 months to pull out his first round of pain pills. My fingers knew the weight of this keychain better than they knew my own name right now. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass of the front door. Troy Price stood in the entryway. I had not heard his footsteps approaching. He pushed the door open just enough to reveal himself, but he did not step aside to let me pass. He did not look like a man doing something cruel. That was the detail that caught in my throat and refused to go down. Jordan's older brother stood in the doorway of my home wearing the dark suit he had worn to the funeral service 2 hours ago. His tie was loosened. He held a ceramic coffee mug in his left hand. He looked like a man crossing items off a Saturday chore list. "The deed to this house was never in your name," Troy said. His voice was perfectly level. "We checked the county records 2 weeks ago." I looked at the coffee mug in his hand. It was the mug I had bought at a craft fair in Gatlinburg last autumn. "I have lived here for 4 years," I told him. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else standing a few feet away. "That does not change anything legally," Troy said. He took a sip from the mug. "Jordan and I started, but the sentence broke apart in the cold air between us. "Jordan is gone," Troy said flatly. He reached out and set the coffee mug down on the interior windowsill. He moved with deliberate slowness, wiping a stray drop of dark liquid from the painted wood. "Your suitcase is right there in the corner of the hallway," he continued, nodding toward the space behind the door. "My mother packed it for you yesterday." The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves in the oak tree by the driveway, but all I could hear was that single word echoing in the space between my ears. Yesterday. Yesterday Jordan was resting in a sterile room at the funeral home. Yesterday I was sitting at a heavy wooden desk signing my name on the bottom line of a death certificate. While I was choosing the color of the casket, Beverly was inside my bedroom. She was opening my closet doors. She was pulling my clothes from the hangers. She was touching my undergarments, folding my sweaters, taking my life apart piece by piece, and putting it into a box. She packed my things while Jordan was already gone, but they had checked the county records 2 weeks ago, when my husband was still breathing. When I was working double shifts at the hospital to cover the copays for his oxygen tanks. I did not scream. I did not ask Troy how he could look himself in the mirror. I just stared past his shoulder into the hallway. The navy blue suitcase stood exactly where he said it was. Jordan had bought that luggage set for my birthday last year, back when we still talked about taking a long weekend trip to Nashville. We never took the trip. I reached past the doorframe and grabbed the thick handle with both hands. I pulled the heavy bag over the threshold, the wheels catching for a second on the brass weather stripping. Troy stepped back. He closed the door. The deadbolt snapped into place with a clean, heavy click that sounded completely final. The October wind in Knoxville carries a specific kind of chill that makes your eyes water without giving you time to ask why. I pulled the heavy suitcase down the driveway, the plastic wheels grinding loudly against the concrete. Lou Hines stood by the chain-link fence, separating her yard from ours. She was 71 years old, a fixture in the neighborhood long before I ever arrived. 12 years ago, she had brought a pot of homemade chicken soup to the porch when Jordan first came home from his first hospital stay. She held a green garden hose spraying a mist of water over a row of wilting hydrangeas. She did not look away when I approached the car. She looked at the closed front door of the house, and then she looked directly at me. "Did you just get kicked out of your own home?" Lou asked. Her voice was pitched low, barely carrying over the sound of the running water. I popped the trunk of my car and lifted the heavy suitcase inside. "I am not exactly sure what just happened." "Well, I am sure," Lou said. She shut off the nozzle. The sudden quiet in the yard felt heavy. "I saw that Troy boy out here changing the front and back locks at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, while you were making the arrangements." I closed the trunk and leaned against the cold metal of the car. My hands felt completely numb. "Could you repeat that for me, Lou? I can write it down and sign my name to it if you need me to," she said firmly. She wiped her wet hands on her gardening apron. "I have the time, the date, and the make of his truck written on a notepad by my telephone." I reached into my purse, found a pen, and wrote her phone number on the back of a grocery receipt. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at the house one last time. The lavender bush Jordan and I had planted last spring was still standing in the corner of the front yard, fighting against the autumn frost. I did not look at the house to memorize it. I looked because the body naturally turns toward the place it believes it belongs, even when the mind knows the locks have been changed. I got into my car, put the car in drive, and headed south. I did not know where I was going until I saw the faded neon sign of a cheap motel on Chapman Highway and pulled into the empty parking lot. Room 14 smelled like industrial bleach and old carpet. The mattress was stiff, sinking only in the middle where thousands of tired people had rested before me. The wall unit air conditioner hummed with a low mechanical rattle that sounded almost exactly like a failing lung. I did not sleep much. There was no comfortable way to position my body when my entire life had been shoved into a suitcase and left in a hallway. Outside the window, the yellow glare of the streetlights sliced through a gap in the cheap curtains, painting a bright, unnatural line across the ceiling. At 3 in the morning, I turned on the bedside lamp. My wallet, my car keys, and the brass key to a house I could no longer enter sat in a neat pile on the laminated nightstand. The phone vibrated against the wood at exactly 4 minutes past 7. It was a strange number with a Nashville area code. Over the last 24 hours, I had signed a death certificate, buried the man I loved, been locked out of my home, and slept in my clothes on top of a motel bedspread. A random phone call before sunrise did not seem like the worst thing that could happen to me. I pressed the answer button. "Hello, I am trying to reach Callie Price," a man said. His voice was professional, carrying the distinct cadence of someone reading from an open file. "My name is Daniel Gaines. I am an investigator with the Special Investigations Unit at Meridian Life Insurance." I sat up slowly. The air conditioner continued its steady rattle. "I am listening." "You are the wife of Jordan Price Gaines?" asked. "I am his widow," I said the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "As of yesterday." Gaines paused. I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. "I am very sorry for your loss, ma'am. Truly. I am calling because our office received a claim submission on Mr. Price's life insurance policy. Policy number ML447192. I need to verify a few details regarding the timeline of events." I stared at the brass house key on the nightstand. "Who submitted the claim?" Beverly Ann Price Gaines answered smoothly. "She is listed as the primary beneficiary on the document." My throat felt tight. When did she submit it? The silence on the line stretched out for a long, uncomfortable moment. When Gaines finally spoke again, his professional tone had shifted into something much more careful. "That is exactly why I needed to speak with you today," Gaines said. The digital claim form was officially submitted at 43 minutes past 11 on Wednesday night. The county death certificate lists the official time of passing as 17 minutes past midnight on Thursday. The math assembled itself in my head before I consciously tried to calculate it. "The claim was filed before he died," I said. My voice was completely flat. By 34 minutes, Gaines confirmed. "Yes." I closed my eyes. The image of the hospital waiting room on Wednesday night flooded my vision. I had been sitting on an uncomfortable vinyl chair on the 3rd floor. The floor nurse had told me Jordan was struggling to breathe, that he needed a quiet environment, and that family could only go into the room one person at a time. Beverly had gone in first. I had sat in the hallway holding a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, watching the clock tick past 11:30. I had waited my turn. And while I was sitting outside trying to be respectful of a mother saying goodbye to her son, Beverly was standing over his hospital bed with her phone in her hand, filling out a financial document. 34 minutes. She knew he was not going to make it through the hour, and her first instinct was to open an application and demand her payout. "What do you need me to do?" I asked the investigator. "I need to meet with you in person," Gaines said immediately. "As soon as you are available." I ended the call and set the phone down next to the brass key. Months ago, back in April, Jordan had looked at me through the haze of his heavy medication and asked a strange question. He had asked if I was keeping the bank receipts for all the medical bills and home repairs I was paying for. He had told me not to delete the emails. I had thought it was just the paranoia of a sick man trying to control the small things he could still manage. Now, sitting in the cold motel room, I realized Jordan had known exactly what kind of people his family were. He had known they would come for everything the second his heart stopped beating. I opened the small notepad from my purse. I picked up my pen and wrote down the facts. Daniel Gaines, Meridian Life. 11:43 on Wednesday, 12:17 on Thursday, 34 minutes. I looked at the words on the paper until they stopped looking like letters and started looking like a map. Then I picked up my phone again and dialed my friend Donna. The dial tone hummed in my ear for 3 seconds before Donna picked up on the first ring. The background noise of the hospital was an immediate sharp intrusion through the small speaker of my phone. I heard the muffled chime of a floor page, the rhythmic squeak of a gurney being pushed down a linoleum hallway, and the distant hurried murmurs of a shift change. It was the sound of my life for the last 4 years, a world that felt more like home than the empty motel room where I now sat. "Callie, are you okay?" Donna's voice was hushed the way it always was when she was tucked into a corner of the ultrasound break room. "She packed my bags, Donna. She did it on Wednesday while Jordan was still alive," I said. I watched a stray ant crawl across the wood grain of the nightstand, and the insurance investigator just called. Beverly filed the claim 34 minutes before the doctor even called the time of death. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. I could picture Donna leaning against the cold brick wall, her brow furrowed under her surgical cap. She filed it while he was still breathing. "Lord have mercy, Callie. That woman has a heart like a peach pit. You need a lawyer. You need one before the sun goes down today. I do not have the money for a retainer, Donna. I used every cent of our savings to pay for the private nurses and the experimental infusions the insurance wouldn't touch," I said. My voice felt brittle like dry leaves. "Do you have your name on the mortgage?" she asked. "No. It was his father's house. Jordan always said we would fix the paperwork when he got better," I replied. "And the bank records, the transfers you made to his account for the roof and the property taxes." Donna's voice grew more insistent, cutting through my fog. "Jordan asked you about those for a reason, Callie. He knew. He was trying to leave you a trail. Go find those receipts. Every single one of them. Then call me back." I ended the call and stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The air in the motel felt thin, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floral detergent. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my mobile banking app. My fingers felt heavy as I scrolled back through the months, then the years. Each line of text was a tiny digital ghost of a struggle I had almost forgotten. $1,200 in January for the chemotherapy copay. $900 in February for the specialist in Nashville. $1,400 in Thang Ba when the furnace gave out and Jordan was too weak to even hold a wrench. $31,000. Over 4 years, that was the total I had poured into a house that Troy was currently sitting in. I had never thought of it as an investment or a contribution. I had just thought of it as living. A memory surfaced, then unbidden and sharp. It was Thang 2, a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the oncology ward. Jordan was gray against the white sheets, his eyes sunken but suddenly startlingly clear. He had reached out and caught my wrist as I was trying to adjust his IV line. "Do you keep the receipts, Callie? The ones from the transfers?" he had whispered. His voice was a dry rasp, but his grip was firm. "Which ones, honey? Why are you worried about that right now?" I had asked, leaning in close. "Just keep them. Do not delete the app. Do not clear the emails," he said, looking past me toward the door, where his mother's shadow was visible through the frosted glass. "I am just saying. Promise me." I had promised him, thinking he was just tired, thinking the morphine was making him dwell on the mundane. I realized now that Jordan had been fighting a silent war for months. Beverly had started visiting him alone in Thang Tam. She always chose the evening shifts, the long hours when I was working overtime at the hospital to keep us afloat. She would be gone by the time I arrived, leaving nothing behind but the faint, cloying scent of her expensive perfume and a son who seemed quieter, more withdrawn. I would ask what they talked about, and Jordan would only shrug, his gaze fixed on the television or the window. Thang Sao. That was when he had asked for his laptop. I remembered him sitting up for 3 hours, his breathing labored, tapping away at the keys while I non-lie in the doorway with a tray of soup. He had told me he was just organizing his work benefits. He had been updating the group life policy through his company, making sure my name was the only one on the line. He had done it right after one of Beverly's solo visits. The pieces were finally starting to lock together, forming a picture that made my stomach turn. 11:43 p.m. Beverly was in that room on Wednesday night. She had been there when the nurse told her the end was coming. She had stepped into the hallway, used her thumb to open an app, and traded her son's life for a payout before his heart had even finished its final beat. I closed the banking app and opened my email. I typed payment confirmation into the search bar. 47 results. Every mortgage payment, every repair bill, every direct transfer to our joint account from the days when Jordan could no longer drive to the bank. He had told me not to delete them. He had given me the map, and I had been too blinded by grief to read it until now. I stood up and grabbed my car keys. I needed to see the house one more time, not to go inside, but to ground myself in the reality of what I was fighting for. I drove back to Elm Street, parking 2 blocks away under the shade of a sprawling maple tree. I walked slowly, keeping my head down until I was across from the driveway. The lights were on in the living room. I saw a silhouette move past the kitchen window. It was Beverly. I recognized the stiff, upright posture, the way she held her head like she was presiding over a courtroom instead of a kitchen. Troy's truck was still in the driveway, parked right over the spot where Jordan used to wash his car on Saturday mornings. The lavender bush I had planted was nodding in the breeze. It looked small and fragile against the heavy brick of the house. I had spent 4 years building a life within those walls, thinking that love and a shared table were enough to make a home. I had been a fool to think that a marriage license was more powerful than a deed in a county that only cared about ink and paper. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Donna again. "What do you see?" she asked when I picked up. "They are in there," I said. I watched Beverly close the kitchen curtains. "They are acting like I never existed, like I was just a house guest who stayed too long." "And you?" Donna asked. "I am standing in the street," I replied. I looked at the front door, the brass lock glinting in the fading afternoon sun. "But I am not staying here. I am going to find Nora Cole's office downtown. She handled my aunt's estate. She is tough." "Good," Donna said. "What changed your mind?" I looked at the lavender bush one last time. I remembered Jordan's hand on my wrist in that hospital room, the desperate clarity in his eyes. "Jordan did not just die," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "He left me a job to finish. And I am going to finish it." I turned my back on the house and walked toward my car. The grief was still there, a heavy, cold weight behind my ribs, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. There was something else, now something sharp and focused. I got behind the wheel, pulled out into traffic, and didn't look back in the rearview mirror once. The morning air in Knoxville felt like a damp wool blanket, heavy with the scent of wet pavement and the sharp metallic tang of an approaching winter. I didn't head straight to the lawyer's office downtown. Instead, I found myself pulling the car to the curb, 3 houses down from the place on Elm Street, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the plastic groaned. The sun was a pale, sickly disk, struggling to pierce through the gray haze of the Tennessee sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the non-emergency number for the local precinct. A patrol car arrived 10 minutes later, its tires crunching over the fallen maple leaves that littered the gutter. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and dark against the morning light. Officer Reese, a man with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes that had seen too many domestic disputes, met me on the sidewalk. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply handed him my driver's license, which still bore the address of the house where Troy was currently drinking my coffee. We walked up the steps together. I felt the familiar unevenness of the third plank, the one Jordan always promised to sand down but never did. Reese knocked a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through my own ribcage. The door opened slowly, revealing Troy. He still looked unbothered, though, his eyes narrowed when they landed on the badge pinned to Reese's chest. "Is there a problem?" Officer Troy asked, his voice a smooth drawl that set my teeth on edge. "This lady says she lives here," Reese said, gesturing toward me with a gloved hand. "She says you changed the locks and refused her entry." Troy leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. "The deed to this property belongs to my mother, Beverly Price. This woman has no legal right to be on the premises. Jordan is gone. The arrangement is over." Officer Reese pulled a small black notebook from his breast pocket and flipped it open. "How long has she been living here, sir?" Troy hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the interior of the house, where I knew Beverly was likely listening from the shadows of the hallway. She stayed here with my brother for 4 years, but like I said, she was never on the deed. That isn't what I asked, Reese said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone that brooked no argument. Tennessee Code Section 6628-504 is very clear on this. Any person who has established residency, regardless of whose name is on the deed, must be served with a formal notice and go through a legal eviction process before they are forced to leave. Did you serve her papers, Mr. Price? Did you get a court order before you swapped out those cylinders yesterday morning? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Troy looked past the officer, his jaw tightening as he caught sight of movement at the edge of the neighbor's property. Mrs. Lou Hines was standing by her white picket fence, her gardening shears held at her side like a weapon. She stepped forward, her floral apron fluttering in the breeze. I saw the whole thing, Officer Lou called out, her voice clear and sharp as a church bell. I saw this boy out here, with a screwdriver and a box of new locks at 9 o'clock yesterday morning. I wrote it down in my kitchen ledger. I saw him hauling her suitcase out to the porch like she was yesterday's trash. He didn't serve her a thing but a cold shoulder. Troy looked at Lou like he wanted to dismantle her, but the presence of the law kept his feet planted on the rug. Reese turned back to Troy, his expression flat. You've committed an illegal eviction, Mr. Price. I suggest you consult with your mother and a very good lawyer before you take another step. Ma'am, he said, turning to me, you have every right to be in this house right now, but for your own safety, I'd suggest you let a judge handle the rest of this. I nodded, feeling a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. I wasn't going back inside today. I didn't want to breathe the same air as the woman who had packed my life into a box while my husband was still fighting for his last breath. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and walked back to my car. As I pulled away, I saw Troy staring at me through the glass, his face a mask of simmering resentment. He had thought this would be easy. He had thought I was just a girl who would fade away into the Tennessee hills once the money was gone. He was wrong. I drove downtown, the skyline of Knoxville rising up to meet me. The office of Nora Cole was tucked into a renovated brick building on a quiet side street, the windows gleaming with the reflected light of the midday sun. The waiting room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint citrusy scent of furniture polish. It was a room where serious things were decided in hushed tones, away from the messiness of the world outside. Nora Cole was a woman who looked like she was made of iron and silk. She was 49, with hair the color of charcoal and eyes that seemed to read the fine print of my soul before I even opened my mouth. She listened to me for 12 minutes. I told her about the mortgage payments. I told her about the furnace and the roof. I told her about the 34 minutes Gaines had mentioned on the phone. I told her about the suitcase Beverly had packed before Jordan was cold. Nora didn't interrupt. She sat behind a desk made of dark cherry wood, her fountain pen poised over a yellow legal pad. When I finally stopped talking, she set the pen down with a soft click. 34 minutes, Nora said, her voice a low melodic hum. That is the kind of detail that makes a case, or breaks a heart, mostly both. Can we do anything? I asked, leaning forward. The deed is a problem, Nora admitted, her gaze drifting toward the window, but Tennessee recognizes something called a constructive trust. If we can prove you contributed significantly to the value of the home with the reasonable expectation of an ownership interest, a judge can award you a portion of the equity. It's an uphill climb, but your 47 emails and bank records are the crampons we need for the ice. She leaned in closer, her expression sharpening. The illegal eviction was a gift. Troy's arrogance has given us leverage we didn't have an hour ago. But the insurance claim is the real shark in the water. If the Special Investigations Unit is looking at a timestamp that precedes the time of death, they aren't just looking at a clerical error. They are looking at intent. And if Beverly Price is found to have had a hand in accelerating Jordan's passing, the Slayer rule comes into play. The Slayer rule, I repeated the words, feeling heavy and dangerous. A person cannot profit from a death they caused, Nora explained. If she is even civilly liable, she is barred from inheriting a single cent of his estate. But Callie, I need you to listen to me. This is not going to be a quick fight. People like the Prices don't just hand over the keys. They will dig in. They will try to make you look like a gold digger, a liar, or worse. You cannot speak to them. You cannot text them. You go through me for every single breath you take regarding that house. I nodded, my throat tight. I understand. Good, Nora said, standing up. Then we start with the paper trail. I want every medical record, every nursing note, and every visitor log from Jordan's final weeks. If Beverly was in that room when he was dying, I want to know exactly what the nurses saw. I left her office feeling like I finally had a compass in the middle of a storm. I drove back toward the hospital, the familiar route, taking me past the grocery store where Jordan used to buy me those cheap carnations every Tuesday because he knew I loved the smell. The ache in my chest was still there, a constant throbbing reminder of what I had lost, but it was being overlaid by a cold clinical necessity. I worked in the hospital system, which gave me a key that Beverly didn't have. I knew the girls in medical records. I knew how to navigate the digital labyrinths of the Knox County Healthcare Network. I walked into the archives, the air conditioned to a crisp, dry temperature that felt like it belonged in a morgue. Donna met me near the elevators, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. She handed me a cup of black coffee that was mostly just hot water and bitterness. "I heard about the police on Elm Street," she whispered. "The whole neighborhood is talking." "Let them talk," I said, my voice steady. "I need the logs, Donna. I need to know who was in Jordan's room on Wednesday night." We walked toward the back of the records department, where a woman named Martha sat behind a wall of monitors. Martha had been there for 30 years. She knew where every ghost in the hospital was buried. She looked at me over her reading glasses, her expression softening when she saw my face. "I heard about Jordan, honey," Martha said softly. "He was a good man. He always had a joke for the night shift." "I need his visitor logs from the last month, Martha," I said, leaning against the counter, "and the nursing notes from his final night. Please." Martha hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She knew the rules, but she also knew the prices. Everyone in the hospital had seen Beverly stalking the hallways like she owned the floor. Martha began to type the rapid-fire clicking of the keys, the only sound in the small, cramped office. "He asked for you," Martha whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It's right here in the nursing notes. 10:15 p.m. on Wednesday night. Nurse Sutton wrote it down. Patient requested wife. Family member present stated wife was unavailable." The coffee cup slipped from my hand, splashing dark liquid across the toes of my sneakers. I didn't feel the heat. I only felt the ice that had just formed in the center of my stomach. "Unavailable," I rasped. I was sitting 3 floors up in the surgical waiting room. I told the receptionist I was there. I told the floor nurse I was waiting my turn. "There is more," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "Beverly was in the room from 9:47 until 11:21. The claim was filed at 11:43. Jordan didn't pass until 12:17. That means she left his bedside, walked to the elevator, and hit the submit button on her phone while her son was still struggling to pull air into his lungs." I stared at the monitor, the glowing green text blurring before my eyes. Jordan had called for me. He had been lying there in that room, surrounded by the sterile white walls and the rhythmic beeping of the machines, and he had wanted me. He had reached out into the dark, and Beverly had blocked his hand. She had stood there and lied to the nurse, ensuring that I stayed in the hallway while she finalized her transaction. "I need copies," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a very long way away. "I need every single word of this." Martha didn't ask for a form. She didn't ask for a signature. Ba simply hit the print button. The machine began to hum, spitting out pages of white paper that contained the evidence of a betrayal I couldn't even begin to fathom. I walked out of the hospital with the folder clutched to my chest. The Tennessee afternoon had turned gray and drizzly, a fine mist settling over the parked cars like a shroud. I got into my car and sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the heater blowing hot air against my frozen knees. I looked at the folder. I thought about Jordan's eyes in that hospital room back in Thang 2. I thought about the lavender bush and the dripping faucet. I thought about the 34 minutes that Beverly thought would buy her a new life, at the expense of mine. I picked up my phone and called Nora Cole. "I have the nursing notes, Nora," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a Knoxville winter. She told the nurse I wasn't there. She kept me out of the room while he was calling for me. "Then we don't just have a constructive trust," Callie Nora replied, her voice crackling with a sharp professional energy. "We have a war. I'll see you in the morning. Bring the papers. And Callie, don't look back. There is nothing left for you on Elm Street but a debt that needs to be paid." I pulled out of the parking lot, the wipers on my car pushing the rain aside in steady, rhythmic strokes. The road ahead of me was dark, and the climb was steep, but for the first time since Jordan died, I knew exactly where I was going. I was going to find the truth, and I was going to make Beverly Price wish she had never packed that blue suitcase. The folder sat on the passenger seat of my car, like a live wire humming with a frequency that made my skin itch. I drove away from the hospital, but the sterile scent of the archives seemed to cling to my clothes, a mixture of old paper and the lingering cold of a building that never truly sleeps. The rain had slowed to a miserable gray drizzle that blurred the taillights of the cars ahead of me into smears of red ink. I didn't go back to the motel immediately. I couldn't sit in that cramped room with the smell of bleach and the sound of the rattling air conditioner while these pages were staring at me. I pulled into a diner on the outskirts of town, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who looked like she had been pouring coffee since the Eisenhower administration. I slid into a corner booth, the folder heavy in my hands, and ordered a slice of apple pie I knew I wouldn't eat. The diner was nearly empty, the only sound the low murmur of a radio playing old country songs and the rhythmic scrape of a spatula against the griddle. I opened the folder. The first page was the bank summary I had printed earlier, but now seeing it alongside the nursing notes, the numbers felt different. They weren't just transactions anymore. They were a timeline of my life being systematically drained while another woman was preparing to harvest the remains. $31,200. I traced the line for November of the previous year. $3,400 for the furnace. I remembered that night. The house had been so cold that Jordan's breath was visible in the living room, a thin white mist that seemed to mock the failing heat of his body. I had spent 4 hours on the phone with technicians until I found one willing to come out in a snowstorm. I had paid him with a check from my personal account, the one I had kept separate from the joint household funds just in case. Jordan had watched me sign it, his eyes tracking the movement of my pen with a sadness I hadn't understood at the time. He had tried to apologize, his voice a dry whisper, but I had just kissed his forehead and told him that money was just paper, and paper didn't keep us warm. He had known then. Even in the cold, he had known that every dollar I spent was a brick I was laying in a house that was being pulled out from under me. I flipped to the nursing notes from that final Wednesday. My eyes skipped past the clinical observations of his heart rate and oxygen saturation, landing instead on the 10:15 p.m. entry. Patient requested, wife. I felt a fresh wave of nausea roll over me. While I was sitting upstairs staring at a flickering television in the waiting room and trying to convince myself that no news was good news, Jordan was calling for me. He was looking at the door, expecting to see my face, and instead he saw Beverly. She had stood there in her charcoal gray suit, her pearls reflecting the harsh light of the monitors, and she had looked a professional nurse in the eye and lied. She had erased my presence from the room as easily as one might wipe a smudge from a window. I reached into the folder and pulled out a small handwritten note Donna had tucked into the side. It was a name and a phone number, May Sutton, the nurse who had been on duty that night. Donna had added a scribbled postscript. She's on the morning shift in cardiac now. She remembers everything. I took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, the bitterness coating my tongue. I needed to hear it from her. I needed the human voice to validate the ink on these pages. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. It was late, but a nurse's life wasn't measured by the sun. I dialed the number. Hello, the voice on the other end was tired, grounded in the weary pragmatism of someone who spent 12 hours a day fighting the inevitable. May, my name is Callie Price. I'm Jordan Price's wife. There was a long silence. I heard the faint rustle of clothing, and the sound of a chair scraping across a floor. I wondered if you would call, May said softly. I saw you in the hallway after it was over. You looked like you were walking through a dream. I was, I said, my voice cracking. May, I have the nursing notes. I see what you wrote at 10:15. I shouldn't have listened to her, May said, the regret sharp in her voice. But she was so authoritative. She told me you had been overwhelmed, that you had asked her to handle the communication for a few hours so you could get some air. She said you were unavailable and specifically didn't want to be disturbed unless it was the very end. I was 3 floors up, I whispered. I never left the building. I know that now, May replied. When I went out to the waiting room at 11 to check on the family, the desk clerk told me you had been there all night. I looked for you, but I must have missed the corner where you were sitting. By the time I got back to the room, the mother was gone. She walked out at 11:21. She didn't even say goodbye to the staff. She just grabbed her coat and vanished. She went to the elevator to file the insurance claim. I said the words, feeling like stones in my mouth. She submitted it at 11:43. He was still alive, May. I know, May said, her voice dropping. I checked his vitals at 11:30. He was still fighting. He asked for you one last time. He couldn't say your name clearly anymore, but he kept looking at the chair where you usually sat. I told him I was looking for you. I told him you were coming. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the diner window. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a rhythmic red glow over the table. Jordan had died thinking I wasn't there. He had died waiting for a door to open that his mother had locked from the inside. May, would you be willing to say this in a deposition? Under oath, I already talked to my supervisor, May said. I kept my own notes that night. I always do when a family member seems involved. I'll stand by what I saw, Callie. It wasn't right. None of it was right. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange cold strength radiating from my chest. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This wasn't even about the $31,000. This was about the fact that Beverly Price had stolen Jordan's peace in his final moments to ensure her own financial comfort. She had turned a sacred departure into a heist. The next morning, I was back in Nora Cole's office before the first pot of coffee had finished brewing. I laid the nursing notes and the bank records on her desk like I was laying out a winning hand of poker. Nora looked through them in silence, her eyes tracking the timestamps with a clinical intensity. "This is the heart of it," Nora said, tapping the 10:15 p.m. entry. "The malicious interference. If we can prove she intentionally isolated him to facilitate the filing of that claim, the Slayer rule isn't just a possibility, it's a mandate. But we have to move fast. She's already petitioning the court for formal probate. She wants to be named the executor of the estate. If she's the executor, she controls everything I said." "Exactly," Nora replied. "She can sell the house, liquidate the accounts, and leave us chasing shadows. We need to file a petition to block her appointment based on the pending investigation by the Special Investigations Unit. And we need to file your constructive trust claim simultaneously." Nora paused, looking at me over the rims of her glasses. "There's one more thing. I did some digging into Jordan's employment records. You mentioned he updated a policy in Thang Sao." "Yes," I said. "He told me he was organizing his benefits." Nora pulled a letter from a manila envelope. "I received this from the Human Resources Department at his old firm this morning. It's a confirmation of his group life insurance policy. It's separate from the Meridian policy his mother is chasing. This one is through the company. It's worth 2 times his annual salary. And, he updated the beneficiary on the 15th of Thang Sao." Nora said, a small grim smile touching her lips. "He removed his mother and named you as the sole beneficiary. It's worth $85,000, Callie." I felt the air leave my lungs. $85,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a lifeline. It was Jordan's way of making sure I had a roof over my head even if the house on Elm Street was lost. He had done it right after Beverly started her solo visits. He had seen the vultures circling, and he had built a cage for the only thing he could still protect. "Does Beverly know?" I asked. "Not yet," Nora said. "The company only notifies the beneficiary. She likely assumes the Meridian policy is the only one because that's the one she was paying for years ago. She doesn't realize he took out a supplemental policy on his own." "She's going to be furious," I said. "Let her be," Nora replied. "Fury leads to mistakes, and we are going to need her to make a lot of them." The rest of the week was a blur of signatures and phone calls. I spent my nights in the motel room, surrounded by boxes of bank statements and old tax returns. I tracked every penny. I found the receipt for the landscaping in the spring. I found the invoice for the new gutters. I found the medical bills I had paid when the primary insurance reached its cap. By Friday, I had a documented total of $31,212 of my own money that had been invested in a property I didn't own. On Monday morning, Nora filed the papers. By noon, the legal machinery of Knox County was beginning to turn against Beverly Price. I was at the hospital finishing a shift when Donna found me in the cafeteria. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "Troy is here," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "He's in the lobby. He's looking for you." I felt a spark of fear, but it was quickly smothered by a heavy blanket of resolve. I wasn't the woman who had pulled a blue suitcase across a threshold anymore. I walked toward the lobby, my footsteps echoing on the polished tile. Troy was standing near the information desk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a expensive wool coat. He looked out of place in the world of scrubs and stethoscopes, a predator in a place of healing. When he saw me, his face twisted into a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something else there now, uncertainty. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Troy said, his voice a low hiss as I approached. "Filing those papers, dragging my mother into court over a house you never owned." "I'm not thinking about being smart, Troy," I said, stopping a safe distance away. "I'm thinking about the truth. I'm thinking about the 34 minutes your mother spent on her phone while her son was dying." Troy flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his jaw. "That was a mistake. A technical error. My mother was in shock." "She wasn't in shock when she told the nurse I wasn't in the building," I countered. "She wasn't in shock when she started packing my clothes on Tuesday afternoon." "You're going to lose," Callie, Troy said, stepping closer. The smell of his cologne was sharp and cloying. "We have the deed. We have the history. You're just a girl he picked up along the way. You don't belong in that house, and you sure as hell don't belong in this family." I don't want to be in your family, Troy, I said, my voice rising just enough to draw the attention of a nearby security guard. I just want what Jordan intended for me to have. And I think the court is going to be very interested in why your mother was so eager to file for a payout while her son's heart was still beating. Troy stared at me for a long moment, the silence between us vibrating with a violent energy. He realized then that he couldn't bully me into disappearing. He realized that the woman he had evicted was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly how much he had to lose. This isn't over, Troy said, turning on his heel and walking toward the glass doors. I know I whispered to the empty space he left behind. It's just beginning. I walked back to the archives, my heart thumping, a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. I had the bank records. I had the nursing notes. I had the $85,000 policy. And most importantly, I had the truth. Beverly and Troy had the house, but the foundation was made of lies, and I was going to make sure every single one of them crumbled. I sat down at the computer and started printing a fresh copy of the visitor logs. I wanted to see the timestamps one more time. I wanted to see the exact moment Beverly Price walked into that room on Wednesday night. I wanted to see the face of the woman who thought she could steal a husband's final words and get away with it. As the printer hummed, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting. And I knew deep in my bones that Jordan was right there with me, holding the light so I could see the way. The drive to Nashville felt like a descent into a different kind of winter, one where the cold didn't just bite at your skin, but settled deep into the marrow of your bones. The gray sky of Tennessee hung low and heavy, a vast unblinking eye watching the miles of interstate blur past my window. Nora Cole sat in the driver's seat of her sleek black sedan, her hands steady on the leather-wrapped wheel, her profile a study in iron-willed composure. I watched the skeletal trees clawing at the horizon and thought about how many times Jordan and I had talked about this drive, imagining it as a gateway to a weekend of music and laughter instead of a journey toward a sterile conference. Room. We arrived at the Meridian Life Insurance headquarters just as the midday sun made a weak, unsuccessful attempt to pierce the overcast ceiling. The building was a monolith of glass and steel, reflecting a distorted version of the city back at itself. Inside, the air was filtered and thin, carrying the faint, sharp scent of expensive toner and industrial floor wax. Daniel Gaines was waiting for us in a small conference room on the 12th floor. He didn't look like a man who spent his days chasing ghosts and uncovering betrayals. He looked like a high school geography teacher who had seen too many semesters of uninspired students. His hair was a salt and pepper thicket, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that had been broken at least once, and his white button-down shirt was crisp but lacked a tie. He had the kind of face that learned to remain perfectly still while the rest of the world fell apart. Nora took the seat to my left, her presence a silent grounding force. She had warned me in the car to let Gaines lead, to answer only what was asked, and to keep my emotions locked in a drawer. I nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my fingernails digging into the soft meat of my palms. Gaines placed a thick manila folder on the mahogany veneer table but didn't open it immediately. He looked at me, his eyes neutral and searching. A digital recorder sat between us, its small red light glowing like a steady warning coal. Mrs. Price, I need to confirm for the record that you were not the individual who submitted the claim on policy ML 447192. Gaines began, his voice a steady, practiced baritone. No, I said, my voice sounding thin in the quiet room. I didn't even know that policy existed until you called me at the motel. And you were unaware that Beverly Price was the named beneficiary. Gaines asked, his pen poised over a legal pad. Jordan told me he was going to update everything once he was back on his feet, I replied, thinking of the hospital bed and the way his hand felt in mine. I assumed the paperwork had been handled years ago, or that I was the natural choice as his wife. Gaines made a quick note, the scratch of his pen, the only sound in the room. Policy ML 447192 was issued in 2011 when Mr. Price was 23 years old. Beverly Price paid the premiums for the first 10 years. However, from 2018 until the present, the records show the premiums were paid from an account belonging solely to Jordan Price. So she was the beneficiary, but he was the owner, Nora interjected, her voice sharp and clinical. Precisely, Gaines said. He flipped open the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward us. It was a copy of the electronic claim form, the metadata printed in small, unforgiving black type at the top. The claim was submitted via the Meridian mobile app at 11:43 p.m. on October 17th. The death certificate issued by Knox County confirms the time of death as 12:17 a.m. on October 18th. He paused, letting the numbers hang in the air like a cold mist. 33 minutes and 53 seconds before he passed. Has she offered an explanation for this? I asked, my heart thumping a hollow rhythm against my ribs. She claims it was a technical error, Gaines said, his expression remaining unreadable. She stated that she began filling out the form at 11:30 when she believed the end was imminent, but that she accidentally hit the submit button before she was finished. Nora leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Does the app save drafts? Gaines allowed a small grim shadow of a smile to touch his lips. It does. The draft was created at 11:31. It was submitted at 11:43. Our forensic digital team found no edits or changes between those two timestamps. The form was filled out with deliberate intent and submitted with deliberate intent. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, the kind that comes when a nightmare is confirmed as reality. Beverly hadn't been fumbling with a phone in her grief. She had been calculating. She had sat in that room, watched her son struggle for air, and used those minutes to ensure her financial future. Meridian's Special Investigations Unit has opened a formal investigation. Gaines continued closing the folder with a soft final thud. We have placed a freeze on all payments associated with this policy until the investigation is complete. Furthermore, due to the nature of the timeline, we have referred the file to the FBI field office in Nashville. The FBI, I whispered, the weight of the words sinking into the room. Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1033, Gaines said, Insurance fraud involving interstate commerce is a federal crime. We are required by law to report any suspicious activity of this magnitude. Nora placed her hand on the table, her fingers resting near mine, a silent reminder to stay grounded. We had won a significant battle, but the war was expanding in ways I hadn't imagined. Gaines gathered his papers, but before he stood up, he looked at me with a directness that made my breath catch. There is something else you should know, Mrs. Price, though this is outside the scope of the formal claim record. Go on, I said. When the SIU pulls medical records for a claim of this nature, we don't just look at the day of death. We look at the trajectory. We look at the medication logs, the visitor patterns, and the nursing observations over the final 24 months. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. If there is any evidence that a death was not entirely natural, we have a mandate to report that as well. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like it's screaming. I thought of the $85,000 policy Jordan had hidden. I thought of his frantic request for the bank receipts. I thought of the way his medication schedule seemed to shift every time Beverly visited him alone. You should look at the nursing notes from Waitamai Sutton on that final Wednesday night, I said, my voice steady despite the ice in my chest. Gaines nodded slowly. We are looking at everything, ma'am. The drive back to Knoxville was a long stretch of silence, punctuated by the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt. The sun was setting, casting long bruised shadows across the Tennessee hills. Nora drove with her usual precision, but I could tell her mind was working through the new variables. You did well today, Nora finally said as we crossed the county line. I just told the truth, I replied, watching the first few stars blink into existence in the darkening sky. That is exactly what was needed, Nora said. But Callie, we have to be realistic. An FBI investigation is a massive machine and it moves slowly. Beverly has resources. Troy knows the local real estate and legal landscape. They will hire the best counsel money can buy the moment they realize the federal government is involved. I know, I said. Our constructive trust claim is solid, but it takes time to navigate the court calendar, Nora continued. The Slayer rule only triggers after a civil or criminal judgment. We could be looking at 18 months of litigation. I looked out at the passing trees, their leaves a riot of orange, gold, and red in the fading light. Knoxville in the autumn was a beautiful place, but it was a beauty built on things that were dying and falling away. Jordan fought for 11 months just to stay with me for one more day, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I can wait 18 months to make sure he gets the justice he deserves. Nora didn't say anything more, but she reached over and squeezed my hand briefly before returning her focus to the road. That night, back in the small rented room that had become my temporary sanctuary, I sat by the window and watched the rain begin to fall. I had moved out of the motel and into a small efficiency apartment on the edge of town, a place with a single chair, a narrow bed, and a kitchenette that smelled faintly of pine cleaner. Donna had brought over a thick wool blanket and a bag of coffee, and she hadn't asked a single question about the Nashville trip. I opened my laptop and looked at the photo of Jordan that I used as my background. He was smiling, his eyes bright, his hand resting on the lavender bush we had planted together. He had tried to tell me, in the receipts, in the insurance updates, in the desperate way he had called my name when he knew his mother was in the room. He had been fighting a war I didn't even know existed, and he had done it all while his body was failing him. The phone rang, breaking the silence of the room. It was an unrecognized local number. I hesitated, then answered. Callie Troy's voice was a low, dangerous rumble on the other end. I hope you're enjoying your little road trip to Nashville. How did you know I was in Nashville, Troy? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. This is a small town, and my mother has many friends, Troy sneered. You think you can just run to the insurance company and play the victim? You think the FBI is going to care about some girl who couldn't even get her name on a deed? I think the FBI cares quite a bit about 34 minutes, Troy. I said, my voice surprising me with its coldness. We have hired Harlan Dupree, Troy said, his tone shifting into something sharper. He's already filing the probate petition. By this time next week, my mother will be the executor of the estate, and you will be nothing but a footnote in Jordan's history. Harlan Dupree is a good lawyer, I said, remembering the name from Nora's list of formidable opponents. I hope you're paying him well. He's going to have a lot of work to do, explaining why your mother was on her phone while her son was dying. Troy didn't answer. He just hung up, the sharp click of the line sounding like a starting pistol. I sat in the dark for a long time, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I wasn't afraid anymore. I felt a strange, focused energy humming through my limbs. Beverly and Troy had the house, and they had the money, and they had the history. But they didn't have the truth, and they didn't have the one thing Jordan had spent his final months ensuring I would have: the receipts. I picked up the wool blanket Donna had brought and wrapped it around my shoulders. Tomorrow I would meet with Nora, and we would prepare for the probate hearing. We would fight for the executor position, and we would fight for the constructive trust, and we would fight until every single lie Beverly Price had told was dragged into the light. I looked at Jordan's photo one last time before closing the laptop. I'm not going anywhere, honey, I whispered to the empty room. I'm finishing what you started. Outside, the rain turned to a light dusting of snow, the first of the season. It covered the pavement in a thin white sheet, hiding the scars of the road and the gray of the concrete. It was a cold, quiet beginning, and I was ready for it. The rain outside my small efficiency apartment had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the thin glass. A cold Nashville winter settling over the city like a heavy gray shroud. I sat at the small laminate table, the glow from my laptop screen, the only light in a room that still smelled faintly of the pine cleaner Donna had used to help me scrub away the ghosts of the previous tenants. My hand hovered over the cold ceramic of my coffee mug as the words of Troy's phone call echoed in the silence. Harlan Dupree. The name felt like a sudden sharp drop in temperature. In Knoxville, Dupree was the kind of lawyer people hired when they didn't just want to win a case, but wanted to erase the opposition entirely. I reached for the folder Nora had prepared for our next move, my fingers tracing the sharp, embossed edges of her firm's stationery. The momentum from our trip to meet Daniel Gaines felt like it was hitting a wall of thick, expensive legal bond paper. It was one thing to have a digital timestamp and a suspicious investigator on our side, but it was another thing entirely to face a man like Dupree in a local probate court where he had been shaking hands with judges for 30 years. The following Monday morning, I sat in Nora's downtown office as she read the formal letter that had arrived via courier an hour earlier. The air in the room was thick with the scent of dark roast coffee and the ozone of a laser printer that had been running since dawn. Outside, a winter storm was brewing the sky, a bruised purple that made the warm wood of Nora's desk look almost orange. They aren't wasting any time, Nora said, her voice tight as she lowered the heavy cream-colored paper. Dupree is moving to have Beverly appointed as the formal executor of Jordan's estate immediately. He's filing a memorandum that characterizes your financial contributions not as an investment, but as voluntary gifts from a devoted spouse. He's arguing that since there was no written agreement, there was no expectation of repayment or equity. I felt my jaw tighten, the muscles aching with a familiar dull throb. Gifts I paid for the furnace, so we wouldn't freeze. I paid the property taxes so the county wouldn't take the roof from over his head while he was in chemo. Nobody gives $31,000 as a gift when they're working double shifts and eating crackers for dinner. I know that, and you know that, Nora said, leaning back in her leather chair, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. But in a courtroom, a gift is the default assumption for a spouse, unless you can prove otherwise. Dupree is going to use your devotion against you. He's going to paint a picture of a grieving mother who is simply trying to settle her son's affairs, while portraying you as someone trying to profit from a tragedy. She paused, flipping to the second page of the letter. And here is the real blow. They are moving to strike your standing to contest the probate entirely. They're arguing that because you aren't on the deed, and weren't mentioned in the original will from 10 years ago, you have no legal interest in the assets. The room seemed to tilt slightly. 10 years ago. Jordan had been 23, healthy and still living under his mother's shadow. He hadn't known then that he would find a woman who would stand by him through the darkest nights of his life. He hadn't known he would need to protect her from the very person who brought him into the world. "What about the 34 minutes?" I asked, my voice, a jagged edge in the quiet room. "What about the FBI investigation Gaines mentioned?" Nora sighed, a sound of professional exhaustion. "The FBI investigation is a ghost until they file charges, Callie. Dupree knows that. He's banking on the fact that a local probate judge won't wait for a federal agency to finish a months-long inquiry before settling a routine estate. He wants to get Beverly in control of the house now. Once she's the executor, she can list that property for sale before we even get a hearing on the constructive trust." The cold I had felt in Nashville returned, settling into the center of my chest. I looked at the bank records spread across the desk, 47 pages of my life documented in black and white, being dismissed as a series of voluntary gifts. The house on Elm Street, with the dripping faucet and the lavender bush, was slipping away into a sea of legal technicalities. I spent the next week in a state of hollow mechanical motion. I worked my shifts at the hospital, moving through the sterile hallways like a sleepwalker. Every time I saw a charcoal gray suit or smelled a hint of cloying perfume, my heart would stutter against my ribs. I waited for the phone to ring for Nora to tell me that the judge had signed the order that Beverly had won, and that the 34 minutes didn't matter after all. Donna found me in the break room on Friday night. I was staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee, the steam long since gone. The fluorescent lights above us flickered a rhythmic, irritating buzz that seemed to match the static in my brain. "You haven't eaten since yesterday, have you?" Donna asked, sliding a wrapped sandwich across the table. "I'm not hungry," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Callie, look at me," Donna said, her voice soft but firm. "I saw Troy today. He was at the bank downtown when I was making a deposit. He looked like a man who thought he'd already won the lottery. He was laughing with the teller, talking about moving on and clearing out the clutter." I felt a spark of heat behind my ribs, a tiny flickering flame in the middle of the ice. Clutter. My books, my clothes, the ceramic mug I'd bought in Gatlinburg, it was all just clutter to them. The phone in my pocket vibrated. I pulled it out, expecting a debt collector or another threatening call from Troy. It was Daniel Gaines. "Mrs. Price," Gaines said, and even through the small speaker I could hear the shift in his tone. The professional neutrality was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused energy. "I'm calling because we've reached a crossroads in the investigation. We've processed the metadata from the Meridian claim and we've cross-referenced it with the hospital security footage we pulled from the third-floor elevators." I stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the linoleum. Donna watched me, her sandwich forgotten. And I whispered. "Beverly Price didn't just submit the claim at 11:43, Gaines said. "We have footage of her standing in the elevator lobby at 11:41. She's looking at her phone. She isn't crying. She isn't in distress. She's waiting for the elevator to arrive and she's typing. She hits the final button just as the doors open on the ground floor." He paused, a rhythmic tapping sound on his end of the line, the sound of a man who had finally found the piece of the puzzle that fit. "But that isn't the reason I called. We've received the preliminary toxicology report from the coroner's office. Because of the nature of the claim, the state required a full panel." My breath hitched. The ice in my chest seemed to crack a terrifying, jagged sound. What did they find? There were significant fluctuations in Jordan's pain medication levels during his final 8 hours, Gaines said, his voice dropping an octave. "Levels that don't match the hospital's administration log. Specifically, a high concentration of a fast-acting sedative that wasn't prescribed by his oncology team." I leaned against the vending machine, the cold metal biting into my shoulder. I thought of Beverly in that room, the charcoal suit and the pearls, the way she told the waiter I was unavailable. I thought of Jordan calling my name at 10:15 and the way he had drifted into a deep, unreachable sleep by the time I was finally allowed in at midnight. "Gaines, are you saying I'm saying the FBI is no longer just looking at insurance fraud?" Callie Gaines said, and for the first time he used my name. "They're looking at a potential case of criminal interference with medical treatment. But here is the problem: the probate hearing is scheduled for Tuesday. If Dupree gets that executor appointment, he will have the legal authority to block further access to certain private records we need to solidify the connection." I ended the call and looked at Donna. The break room felt smaller than it had a minute ago, the air vibrating with the weight of what I had just heard. It wasn't just about 34 minutes or a blue suitcase. It was about the final 8 hours of Jordan's life. It was about the silence she had enforced while I sat 3 floors away. "I have to call Nora," I said, my hands shaking as I navigated to her contact. I reached her at home, the sound of a television news program in the background. I told her everything Gaines had said, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Callie, stop," Nora said, her voice a sharp command that cut through my panic. "If this is true, the probate hearing on Tuesday isn't just a threat, it's our only chance to stop her. But we can't use an ongoing criminal investigation as evidence in a probate court. The judge will see it as hearsay and prejudice." "Then what do we do?" I asked, a sob catching in my throat. "We know she did something. We know she was sitting there waiting for him to die so she could hit a button on an app. We find another way to block the appointment," Nora said, the sound of her pen scratching against paper audible over the line. "We focus on the medication changes. We don't call it a crime. We call it a discrepancy in care that warrants an independent administrator. And we use May Sutton." I sat back down at the table, the lukewarm coffee finally forgotten. The rain outside had turned to a light dusting of snow, the white flakes swirling in the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. It was the same light that had shone through my motel window the night Gaines first called. "May Sutton is terrified, Nora," I said. "She's worried about her job, about the hospital's liability." "I'll talk to her," Nora replied. "I'll remind her that the truth is the only thing that will protect her professional license if the FBI starts knocking on doors." I hung up and sat in the quiet break room for a long time. Donna stayed with me, her presence a silent, steady anchor in the middle of a storm that was becoming a hurricane. I thought about the house on Elm Street, the way the lavender would look under a layer of fresh snow. I thought about Jordan's eyes in Thang 2 and the $85,000 policy he had hidden like a message in a bottle. He had known the darkness that lived in the charcoal suit, and the pearls. He had been trying to tell me that the locks would be changed, that the gifts would be reclaimed, and that the 34 minutes were already being counted. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The grief was still there, a heavy, jagged rock in the center of my chest, but the ice was gone. In its place was a fire, a cold blue flame that didn't flicker. I wasn't just a widow in a rented room anymore. I was the only person who could speak for a man who had been silenced 22 minutes too early. I stood up and grabbed my coat. "I'm going home, Donna. Are you going to be okay?" she asked, walking me to the door. "I'm going to be ready," I said, looking out at the swirling snow. Tuesday was coming. Harlan Dupree would be there with his memorandum and his handshake. Beverly would be there in her gray suit, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. But I would be there too. And I would have the nursing notes, the bank records, and the memory of a man who had reached out for me at 10:15 when the world was supposed to be unavailable. The battle for Elm Street was over, but the war for the truth was just beginning. And as I drove back to my efficiency apartment, the snow covering the scars of the road, I knew that I wouldn't stop until every single second of those 34 minutes was accounted for. I wouldn't stop until Jordan could finally rest, knowing that the woman he loved had found the map he left behind and followed it all the way to the end. The winter sun rose over Knoxville like a cold, pale coin, casting long, skeletal shadows across the frost-dusted pavement of downtown. I sat in the passenger seat of Nora Cole's sedan, my breath hitching in the dry, recycled air of the heater. We were 3 blocks from the courthouse, and the silence between us was heavy, anchored by the weight of the manila folders resting on my lap. I looked at my hands and noticed the fine tremors in my fingers, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline that had been humming through my veins since Daniel Gaines's late-night call. Nora pulled the car into a parking garage, the tires echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud against the concrete ramps. She didn't turn off the engine immediately. She sat with her hands on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, her profile a study in iron-willed composure against the gray morning light. 7 o'clock sharp. That was the exact time Daniel Gaines called me 3 weeks ago to tell me about the 34 minutes. "It feels like a lifetime has passed since then," I said, my voice sounding brittle in the quiet car. Nora turned to look at me, her charcoal-colored hair perfectly swept back, her eyes sharp and focused. "I found a way, Callie. We don't have to wait for the FBI to finish their investigation to stop Beverly from taking control of that house." I felt my heart skip a beat. "Tell me." "The Slayer rule usually triggers after a criminal conviction, but Tennessee law allows it to apply in civil court as well. The standard of proof is a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it is more likely than not that she played a role in Jordan's passing. It is a much lower bar than a criminal trial. If we file a wrongful death civil suit against her today, before the probate judge approves her as executor, we block her path. A person cannot be the executor of an estate while they are a defendant in a suit involving the death of the owner." "How long will that take?" I asked, leaning forward. The suit itself could take 6 to 9 months, but the block on her executor petition happens the moment we file the paperwork, Nora explained. But you need to be certain, Callie. Once we file this, there is no going back. Beverly will stop at nothing to tear you down. I thought of Jordan's eyes in that hospital room back in April, the way he had begged me to keep the receipts. I thought of the $85,000 group policy he had hidden like a message in a bottle. I thought of him calling my name at 10:15, while his mother stood in the room and lied to the nurse. File it, I said, my voice finally finding its edge. File it immediately. 2 weeks later, I stood in the doorway of Nora's small deposition room. The air was filtered and thin, smelling of printer ink, and the faint, bitter scent of black coffee. A video camera was mounted in the corner, its unblinking lens trained on a long mahogany veneer table. Harlan Dupree sat on the far side, his face a mask of professional boredom as he flipped through a stack of documents. He didn't look up when I entered, but I saw the way his jaw tightened. May Sutton arrived a few minutes later. She was dressed in a navy blue business suit that looked slightly too large for her slight frame, and she carried a thick bundle of papers clutched to her chest. She looked at me once, a quick supportive glance before taking her seat at the head of the table. I brought my own copies of the nursing notes, May said, her voice steady despite the sterile intensity of the room. I wanted to have them in my hand while I gave my statement. Nora began the questioning with a clinical precision. Dupree didn't interrupt at first. He sat back and watched his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. Nurse Sutton, were you on duty the night of October 17th? Nora asked. I was, May replied. I worked the night shift from 8 o'clock in the evening until 8 o'clock the following morning. During that shift, did you have contact with the patient, Jordan Price, multiple times? May said, glancing down at her notes. At 10:15 p.m., Mr. Price pressed his call button. When I entered the room, he was awake and asking for his wife, Callie. What were his exact words? Nora leaned in slightly. He said, "Where is Callie? I need to see Callie May read from the page." I stepped out into the hallway to speak with the family member who was present, Beverly Price. And how did Beverly Price respond when you told her the patient was asking for his wife? She told me that his wife was unavailable and wouldn't be coming to the hospital that night, May said, her voice carrying a sharp, clear resonance. Did she offer any explanation? Nora asked. She said Callie was too overwhelmed to be there, May replied. And where was Callie Price at 10:15 p.m.? I found out later that she was sitting in the third-floor surgical waiting room just a few floors away, May said. I saw Dupree's pen stop moving. He looked down at the table, his expression remaining neutral, but the air in the room seemed to grow even colder. Did Mr. Price ask for his wife again? Nora continued. He did, May said, her voice dropping an octave. At 11 o'clock, after Beverly Price had left the room, he asked for her one more time. He kept looking at the door. I told him I was looking for her. I told him she was coming. Nurse Sutton, did you make any other notes that night? Nora asked. I did, May said, reading from the final page of her bundle. Patient repeatedly requested spouse. Family member present stated spouse unavailable. Patient appeared distressed. Vitals monitored at 10:20, 10:45, and 11:10. And who signed those notes? I did, May said firmly. M. Sutton RN. I recorded them at 11:23 p.m. immediately after my last check of his vitals. Nora set her pen down with a soft final click. She turned to Dupree. The notes were created at 11:23. Beverly Price left that room at 11:21. The claim for the life insurance policy was submitted at 11:43. That is a window of 22 minutes. Dupree didn't say a word for several long, agonizing seconds. He stared at the documents, then slowly closed his folder. May Sutton gathered her papers, smoothed the corners, and placed them back into her bag. She stood up and looked at me one last time before leaving the room. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was already vibrating in the air between us. That evening, the sun set over the ridge in a riot of bruised purple and orange. I sat in my small efficiency apartment, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. The radiator hissed and rattled, a mechanical rhythm that felt like a failing heart. I thought about Troy and Beverly sitting in that house on Elm Street. I wondered if Dupree had called them yet. I wondered if Beverly was sitting on her sofa, looking at the photos of Jordan on the wall, still believing she could control the narrative. My phone rang. It was Donna. I heard about the deposition, Donna whispered. May Sutton is a hero, Callie. She told me she wouldn't have been able to sleep if she hadn't said it. I know, I said, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the window. But it isn't over yet, Donna. Beverly is going to fight back. Let her fight, Donna said. She is fighting the truth now, and the truth doesn't blink. I hung up and looked at the photo of Jordan on my nightstand. The grief was still there. a heavy, jagged rock in the center of my chest, but the fog of the last few months was finally lifting. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was moving toward the light. The hearing was only 6 weeks away. I knew that when I stood in that courtroom, I wouldn't just be fighting for a house or a life insurance policy. I would be fighting for the final words Jordan never got to say. I would be fighting for the 34 minutes that his mother tried to steal from him. And as the snow began to fall outside, covering the city in a thin white shroud, I knew that I was ready. Jordan had left me the receipts, and I was going to make sure every single one of them was paid in full. The air inside the Knox County Courthouse was thick with the scent of old floor wax and the low electric hum of a building that held the weight of 1,000 broken promises. I adjusted the lapel of my navy blue blazer, the fabric crisp and unfamiliar against my skin. I had chosen the color because it wasn't black. I had worn enough black to last a lifetime, and today was not about mourning. It was about the cold, hard light of a Tuesday morning in February. Nora Cole walked beside me, her heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence on the polished marble floors. She didn't look at the people we passed. Her focus was straight ahead, her leather briefcase swinging slightly with every step. Donna was already there, sitting in the front row of the gallery, her face a pale moon in the dim light of the high ceiling. She gave me a small, tight nod, her fingers laced together in her lap. Harlan Dupree was already seated at the defense table. He looked older than he had in the deposition, his face lined with the weariness of a man who knew he was defending a crumbling fortress. Beside him sat Beverly. She was dressed in a suit, the color of wet slate, her pearls glowing with a dull white light under the fluorescent tubes. She didn't turn to look at me. She sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line of practiced aristocratic sorrow. Troy sat behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the back of his mother's head. The bailiff called us to order, and Judge Whitfield took the bench. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of Appalachian oak, his eyes sharp and unblinking behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened the file, adjusted his sleeves, and looked down at the assembled parties. "This is the matter of the estate of Jordan Price," the judge began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "We are here to address the petition for executor and the competing civil claim of wrongful death and constructive trust. Counsel, proceed." Nora stood up. She didn't use a podium. She stood in the center of the well, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. She laid out the timeline like she was drawing a map to a crime scene. She spoke about the 34 minutes. She spoke about the elevator footage. She spoke about the 47 emails and the $31,000 I had poured into a house that Beverly claimed was a gift. "Your Honor," Nora said, her voice dropping into a register of quiet, lethal intensity, "the evidence is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of metadata and nursing logs. We have a sworn statement from the attending nurse, May Sutton, confirming that the defendant intentionally isolated the deceased from his wife during his final hour of consciousness. We have a life insurance claim submitted while the heart of the deceased was still beating. And we have the deceased's own actions, the secret update of a group life policy, to show that he knew exactly who he needed protection from." Dupree stood to counter, but his voice lacked the sharp, aggressive edge it had held weeks ago. He talked about technical errors. He talked about the trauma of a mother losing her son. He talked about the lack of a written contract for the house repairs. But every time he spoke, he had to look at the documents Nora had placed on the evidence table. He had to look at the 10:15 p.m. entry in the nursing log. I watched Beverly's profile. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She sat there like a statue of a woman who believed that if she stayed still enough, the truth would simply pass her by. But the truth wasn't a breeze. It was a tide, and it was rising. Judge Whitfield leaned forward, his elbows resting on the mahogany bench. He looked at Beverly for a long, uncomfortable minute. "Mrs. Price," he said, his voice soft but heavy with a terrifying weight, "the court finds the timing of your electronic submission to be more than a mere coincidence. In 30 years on this bench, I have seen many things, but I have rarely seen a mother so eager to finalize a transaction while her child was still drawing breath." The room went silent, a quiet so absolute that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. "The petition for Beverly Price to serve as executor is denied." The judge announced, the words falling like stones into a still pool. "The court will appoint an independent administrator." Furthermore, based on the preponderance of the evidence presented in the civil filing, the court finds that the criteria for the Tennessee Slayer statute have been met. Beverly Price is hereby barred from any and all interest in the estate of Jordan Price, including the life insurance proceeds from Meridian Life. The constructive trust claim is granted in full, recognizing the financial contributions of Callie Price. The illegal eviction is noted for the record, and damages will be assessed in the final decree. I felt the air leave my lungs. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt a sudden, profound lightness, as if a hand that had been crushing my chest for months had finally let go. I looked at Donna, and I saw the tears tracking down her cheeks. Beverly stood up. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at her lawyer. She turned and walked toward the back of the courtroom, her heels clicking on the floor with the same sharp, arrogant rhythm she had used her entire life. Troy followed her, his head down his face, a mask of pale, simmering anger. They didn't look back once. Nora packed her briefcase, her movements steady and professional. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "It is finished, Callie," she whispered. I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, bright February afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue, and the air tasted of frost and wood smoke. A few weeks later, Daniel Gaines called me one last time. He told me that Beverly had taken a plea deal on federal insurance fraud charges. She wouldn't be going to prison, but she was finished. Her reputation, her finances, her standing in the community, it was all gone. She was a woman living in a house of cards that had finally collapsed. The independent administrator turned the keys to the house on Elm Street over to me on a Friday morning. I drove there alone, my car the only one in the driveway. The neighbor's dog didn't bark this time. The yard was overgrown, the grass brown and dormant under a thin layer of winter slush. I stood on the porch and pulled the brass key from my pocket. It slid into the lock, and for the first time in months, it turned. The sound was a clean, heavy click that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I pushed the door open. The air inside was cold and still smelling of the cinnamon candles Jordan used to light and the faint, lingering scent of pine cleaner. The house was emptier than I remembered. Beverly and Troy had taken some of the furniture before the court order froze the assets, but they hadn't taken the things that mattered. The shelf Jordan had built from pine was still in the living room. The sofa we had found at the second-hand shop was still in the corner. I walked into the kitchen. The left faucet was still dripping. I reached out and gave it 2 hard, familiar twists. The silence that followed was beautiful. I walked out to the backyard. The lavender bush was a cluster of gray, brittle branches shivering in the winter wind. I reached down and snapped a small twig. The center was still green. It was alive. It was just waiting for the season to change. Jordan wouldn't see the lavender bloom this year. He wouldn't sit at the kitchen table and complain about the dripping faucet. He wouldn't know that I had won the house back. I had to live with that truth, and it was a heavy one. But I also knew that he had been with me every step of the way. He had left me the map. He had hidden the policy. He had told me to keep the receipts. Donna arrived an hour later with a box of cleaning supplies and a bag of groceries. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just put on a pair of yellow rubber gloves and started scrubbing the counters. "Where do you want to start?" she asked, her voice echoing in the empty kitchen. "Here," I said, looking at the sunlight pouring through the window. "We start right here." I spent the next few days taking the house back inch by inch. I washed the windows until the glass was invisible. I polished the floors until they reflected the blue of the sky. I moved my clothes back into the closet, and I put the ceramic mug from Gatlinburg back on the shelf. The $85,000 from the group life policy arrived in my account on a Tuesday. It was enough to pay off the remaining mortgage and have a cushion for the first time in my life. I didn't feel rich. I just felt safe. On my first Sunday back in the house, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound, the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I looked at the spot where Troy's truck used to park, and I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. The fire that had burned in my chest for months had settled into a steady, quiet warmth. I had lived in this house for 4 years, and believed that trust was enough. I had been wrong about that, but I hadn't been wrong about Jordan. He had loved me enough to fight for me even when he was leaving. He had made sure that when the locks were changed, I would have the tools to open them again. I stood up and walked down the steps to the lavender bush. I cleared away the dead leaves and the frozen mulch, exposing the dark, rich soil beneath. I would plant more in the spring. I would fill the yard with purple just like Jordan wanted. I walked back inside and closed the door. The lock snapped into place, a sound of finality and peace. This was my home. This was my life. And for the first time since the white chrysanthemums in the cemetery, I knew that the 34 minutes were finally over. I was no longer a widow in a motel room or a defendant in a probate suit. I was just Callie. And that was more than enough. The lavender bush did not bloom in March, but the soil beneath it felt different, softer, as if it were finally breathing after a long, suffocating winter. I stood on the porch of the house on Elm Street, holding a small, weathered leather journal I had found tucked behind the loose brick in the pantry. It wasn't a ledger of debts or a collection of receipts. It was Jordan's voice captured in jagged, ink-stained sentences written during those long nights when the morphine couldn't quite reach the pain. Trust is a bridge he had written on a page dated 2 weeks before he passed. But a bridge needs a foundation of stone, not just air. I hope she never has to read this because that would mean the air was enough. But if she is reading this, Callie, look at the receipts. Look at the paper. Love is the reason we fight, but the law is the shield we use to protect what we love. I realized then that my story was not just about a stolen house or a 34-minute betrayal. It was a cautionary tale for every woman who had ever said, "We don't need it in writing, we're family." I thought of the women in the hospital cafeteria, the ones who worked double shifts and handed their paychecks over to husbands and mothers-in-law without a second thought. I thought of the daughters who believed a parent's promise was as good as a deed. I picked up my pen and added my own entry to the final page of Jordan's journal. I won because he left me a map, but I almost lost because I didn't know I needed one. This spin-off is not just a sequel. It is a legacy. It is the Elm Street Foundation, a series of short, sharp vignettes showing Callie using the $85,000 to help other women navigate the legal minefields of family trust. It's about the waitress at the diner who is being nickel and dimed out of her inheritance and the nurse on the night shift whose name isn't on the car title she paid for. It is a story that proves that being good is not the same as being protected. It teaches that a paper trail is not a sign of a lack of trust, but a profound act of respect for the future. I looked out at the street where Troy's truck once sat, and I felt a new kind of purpose. The truth had set me free, but the evidence had given me the keys. The lavender would bloom soon, and when it did, the scent would reach every house on this block. Every woman has a story about a time she trusted a promise that wasn't written down. What is the one thing you wish you had put in writing before it was too late? Share your receipts with us below. Your story might be the map someone else needs today. The sun finally crests over the ridge of the Great Smoky Mountains, painting the Tennessee sky in hues of bruised violet and gold, and as you sit on the porch of the house on Elm Street, you realize that the silence is no longer heavy with the weight of what was stolen. You watch the first few birds of spring dart between the budding branches of the oak trees, and the lesson of the 34 minutes settles into your bones with a clarity that no courtroom could ever provide. You have learned that in the quietest corners of a marriage, in the spaces between the hospital beeps and the shared morning coffees, there is a dangerous comfort in the phrase, "We are family." You believed that love was a shield, that a shared life was its own form of legal standing, and that the person who brought your husband into the world would surely respect the woman who stayed by his side while he was leaving it. But the cold, hard truth of the blue suitcase on the porch and the brass locks that wouldn't turn is that love, however profound, does not write its own history on a county deed. You understand now that protecting yourself is not an act of cynicism or a lack of faith. It is the ultimate act of respect for the life you are building. You look at the garden where the lavender is struggling to break through the frost, and you know that if Jordan had not been brave enough to hide that $85,000 policy, if he had not been meticulous enough to ask you to keep the receipts, the truth of your 4 years together would have been erased by the stroke of a pen. You cannot rely on the shadow of a promise when the sun goes down and the vultures start circling. You have learned that every mortgage payment you make, every roof you repair with your own hard-earned savings, and every sacrifice you make for a shared future must be anchored in ink. A paper trail is not a sign of a failing heart. It is the map you leave for yourself so you can find your way home when the world turns cold. The world of probate courts and insurance investigators does not care about how many nights you spent in a vinyl chair in the oncology ward or how many times you kissed a forehead that was burning with fever. It cares about timestamps, metadata, and the names typed onto a beneficiary line. You have walked through the fire and come out with the knowledge that your security is your own responsibility, and that staying out of the paperwork is just another way of saying you are willing to let someone else decide your worth. You realize that Beverly Price didn't win because she was smarter. She almost won because she understood the power of the document while you were still trusting the power of the heart. As you sip your coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up, you feel a profound sense of duty to the women who are still where you were a year ago, sitting at kitchen tables, pouring their lives into homes they don't own and believing that a wedding ring is a substitute for a legal contract. You want to tell them that the most romantic thing a partner can do is ensure their spouse is never a visitor in their own home. You want to show them that a receipt is a form of love, a way of saying, I value what you bring to this table enough to make sure no one can ever take it away from you. You have turned the pain of the illegal eviction into a foundation of iron, and you know that the next time you plant lavender, it will be in soil that you own, under a roof that can never be locked against you. The $85,000 is not just a payout, it is the price of the final 8 hours of Jordan's life that were stolen from you, and it is the seed money for a future where you never have to ask permission to belong. You have learned that the law is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build a sanctuary or a cage. You chose to build a sanctuary, and in doing so, you have honored the man who spent his last breath trying to give you the keys. The 34 minutes will always be a part of your story, but they no longer define the ending. Think back to the moments in your own life where you chose silence over a signature because you didn't want to make things awkward or show a lack of trust. Have you ever spent your own savings on a home, a car, or a dream that didn't have your name on the title, only to find out that your contribution was seen as a gift when the relationship changed? How many of us are currently living in a house of cards, protected only by the goodwill of people who might change their minds when the money gets tight? What is the one document or the one receipt you are missing right now that would change everything if you were forced to walk away tomorrow? We want to hear from you, not just about the betrayals, but about the moments you realized you had to be your own hero. What was your 34 minutes, and how did you find the strength to demand the receipts? Share your story below, because your courage might be the very thing that helps another woman find her map before the locks are changed.